Part 1, What the Network Hides. The voice came first, old, unhurried. The voice of a man who had seen enough of the world to understand that most things worth saying do not require much volume. They said she was too young, the voice said. Too green, didn't have the rank, didn't have the experience, didn't have any business doing what she was doing. A pause. The kind of pause that has weight behind it. They were wrong on all three counts. Then silence. Then the screen that would eventually show everyone what accountability looks like when someone refuses to look away. But that comes later. What comes first is a Tuesday night in September, a communications center running at half power, and a 24-year-old lieutenant sitting alone at a workstation at 2:47 in the morning, noticing something she was not required to notice. That is where it starts. That is always where it starts. The communications center at Fort Ironwood sat in the northwest corner of the main operations building, a room designed for function rather than comfort, with overhead lighting that ran at reduced power during the night cycle and cast everything in the particular pale yellow of institutional spaces that never quite achieved darkness. The screens were brighter than the room. The servers breathed their quiet mechanical breath. The air conditioning maintained a temperature that was slightly too cold for anyone who was not actively working. Sloan Drummond was actively working. She was 24 years old, 18 months out of MIT, and she had been a communications officer long enough to know that the job was not what people imagined when they imagined it. It was not glamorous. It did not involve the things that got written about in the after-action reports or mentioned in the briefings that senior officers attended. It involved a chair, a workstation, a network that ran continuously and required continuous attention, and the willingness to be present at 2:47 in the morning when the rest of the installation was as close to asleep as a military base ever got. She did not mind the hours. She had always worked better in the quiet. She was running a security audit. Routine infrastructure reviews scheduled quarterly, the kind of task assigned to junior officers during night shifts because it needed to be done and no one senior wanted to stay up to do it. The audit required her to move through the base network, systematically checking traffic patterns, verifying authorization credentials, confirming that the flow of information through Fort Ironwood's communications infrastructure matched what was scheduled and approved and documented. Most of the time it matched. At 2:47 on a Tuesday night in September, it did not. She almost missed it. The anomaly was buried inside the ordinary noise of a base running its overnight operations, disguised well enough that a less careful analyst would have scrolled past it without pausing. But Sloan had been trained at one of the best technical universities in the country to look for patterns in noise, and she had spent 18 months learning the specific rhythms of Fort Ironwood's network, the way a person learns the sounds of a house they have lived in long enough, knowing which creaks are structural and which ones mean something is wrong. This was wrong. Encrypted traffic on military channels. 3 separate connections in the last 60 minutes, all routing through base infrastructure, all terminating at the same external destination. A private server. No authorization code. No scheduled transmission window. No record of approval in any log she could access through her security clearance. She pulled up the packet analysis and leaned forward. The data came back precise and dry, and what it said made her stomach go very still. The traffic was personal, encrypted with private protocols rather than military standards, using the base network, the way someone uses a borrowed tool without asking, quietly and with the confidence of someone who had been doing it long enough to stop worrying about being caught. And buried in the metadata, appearing in each of the 3 connections with the consistency of a signature, were 3 names: Staff Sergeant Brett Harlow, Corporal Todd Pruitt, Specialist Wade Vickers. She sat with that for a long moment. She did not reach for her phone. She did not begin typing a report. She sat with her hands in her lap and let her mind do what 4 years at MIT and 18 months of operational experience had trained it to do, which was to separate what the data showed from what the data meant, and to be very precise about the difference between those two things. What the data showed: 3 personnel using military channels for unauthorized encrypted communications routed to a private off-grid server. What the data suggested: this was intentional and it was not new. She created a folder on her personal encrypted drive. She labeled it with a date and a string of random characters that would mean nothing to anyone who stumbled across it. Then she began copying. Screenshots, packet captures, metadata extractions. The timestamp on every connection recorded with the care of someone who already understood, without being able to say exactly why, that this documentation might one day need to hold up somewhere that mattered. She worked for 2 more hours before she called Earl Maddox. It was nearly 5 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, not with the voice of a man pulled from sleep, but with the voice of a man who kept irregular hours by preference and answered his phone at any of them with the same quality of presence unhurried fully there. She had met him 6 years ago at a gathering of family friends, a quiet man in his late 60s who had said almost nothing for the first 2 hours. And then when someone asked what he had done in the service, had talked about network communications infrastructure in ways that made everyone at the table lean forward and forget their drinks. She had gotten his number before she left that evening. She had called him the night before she accepted her commission, and twice during officer candidate school, and once when she was deciding between assignment options. He had never once told her what to do. He had a way of asking questions that helped her understand what she had already decided. "Something's wrong," she said. "Tell me." She told him. The unauthorized traffic, the private server, the 3 names. He listened without interruption, which was one of the things she valued most about him. "How long has the traffic been running?" he asked when she finished. "I only have tonight's data. To know how far back it goes, I would need to pull the archive logs." "Then pull the archive logs. That creates a record of the access." "Yes," he said, "it does." A pause. "Document everything. Trust the data, not the rank." She knew what the second sentence meant. It meant do not assume that rank is a reliable guide to where the problem is located. "Don't report yet," he said, "not until you understand what you have." After she hung up, she sat for another moment in the pale yellow light, listening to the servers, and thought about the difference between knowing something and being able to prove it. Then she went back to work. The next 19 days were the quietest kind of war. Sloan ran her regular duties without deviation. She processed communications requests, maintained the network infrastructure, filed her daily logs with the precision that had earned her evaluation scores in the top 15% of her officer candidate school class. She attended every required meeting, completed every assigned task, gave no one any reason to look at her twice. Every night in the hours when the communications center was closest to empty, she built her case. The archive server logs went back 5 years. The unauthorized traffic had been running in one form or another for most of that time. It had evolved, grown more sophisticated, more careful, better at concealing itself within legitimate network flow. Whoever was running it had learned from earlier mistakes. The timestamps had shifted over the years. The encryption had been upgraded. The routing had grown more layered. But the core pattern remained, and once Sloan understood the pattern, she could see it with the clarity of something that had always been there waiting for someone to look at it correctly. The traffic spiked at specific recurring intervals. She cross-referenced those intervals against base administrative records she had clearance to access, and what emerged from that cross-referencing made her sit very still at her desk for a long time. Every spike in the unauthorized traffic corresponded within hours to a female officer submitting a formal transfer request. 7 transfer requests in 18 months. 7 women who had filed for reassignment and been approved without investigation, quietly processed and moved to other installations across the country. 7 official records noting entirely routine reasons for the transfers: career development, family considerations, professional opportunities. She laid the dates out in a timeline. Then she laid the traffic logs beside them. The correspondence was not coincidence. She did not use that word even to herself. She used the language of her training. The data indicates a relationship between these events that requires further investigation. But underneath that careful language, something colder and more certain was forming, the kind of knowledge that settles into the body before the mind fully catches up to it. She kept building. She kept documenting. She said nothing to anyone except Earl Maddox, and even to him, she said only enough. On the 14th day, she had a meeting with Major Ronald Bishop. She had prepared a proposal, a communications infrastructure overhaul with revised routing protocols and security upgrades that her analysis showed would improve base operational efficiency by 18%. She had run the numbers multiple times. She had built the presentation carefully, and it was by any honest technical assessment, solid work. Bishop's office was organized with the deliberate tidiness of a man who understood that the appearance of a desk communicated something about its occupant. He was in his mid-50s with the compact, self-contained authority of someone who had spent a career cultivating the right kind of presence. He listened to her presentation. He reviewed the slides. He asked 2 questions, both reasonable, both answered without difficulty. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that functions as punctuation rather than response. "Nice work," he said. He paused just long enough. "For a female officer." The room held that sentence. Sloan felt the tightening in her jaw that she had learned over years of being the only daughter among 4 siblings to recognize as the signal to do nothing visible. Anger spent in the moment was anger wasted. The better use of it was patience and documentation and the right moment, which was never the current moment when the person who had just said something revealing was still in the room. The efficiency improvements apply regardless of who designed them, sir, she said. He waved his hand pleasantly. Of course. Good to see the junior officers contributing, even in communications. Even in communications, as though the operational capacity of a modern military installation did not run on the infrastructure she maintained, as though network security and encrypted data transmission were peripheral concerns rather than the backbone of everything the base did from logistics to command operations. She left his office with the same professional expression she had arrived with. On her encrypted drive, Bishop's name went into a new section. Not for what he had said exactly. For what it told her about the kind of man who says things like that, and what such men tend to miss when they are not paying sufficient attention to the people they have dismissed. She was beginning to understand that Bishop had missed quite a lot. Declan Reeves arrived at Fort Ironwood on a Monday morning, carrying paperwork that said climate assessment and intentions that said something considerably more specific. He was 42 years old with a Navy SEAL background that was perhaps the least interesting item in a career built around finding problems that institutions had decided were easier to leave unfound. He had been dispatched by the Office of the Deputy Inspector General after an analyst in Washington reviewed a 7-point data set and determined that the points were not random. 7 female officers, 18 months, Fort Ironwood, 7 harassment complaints submitted through proper channels, 7 investigations conducted by the same field officer. 7 outcomes, each closed within 72 hours, each using language so consistent across all 7 reports that the probability of natural occurrence was essentially a statement of intent rather than a statistical result. Insufficient evidence. The Deputy Inspector General had called Reeves. Reeves spent his first 6 days at Fort Ironwood doing what 2 decades of operational experience had taught him to do before anything else, which was to understand the physical reality of the environment he was working in. Not through briefings or files or official channels. Through walking. He learned the base the way a surgeon learns an unfamiliar anatomy methodically, without assumptions, paying particular attention to the places where the official map and the actual territory did not quite align. He mapped the camera coverage and the gaps in it. He learned the shift change patterns and the 30-minute windows they created in certain corridors. He identified the maintenance routes that moved between buildings without passing through monitored checkpoints. He noted the parking areas that fell just outside the security sweep radius, the loading bay behind the commissariat at 2100 hours, the gymnasium entrance that faced away from the nearest camera mount. Every installation had a gap between how it was supposed to function and how it actually functioned. Most commanders found it easier to look away from that gap. Reeves had built his career in it. On the morning of his second day, he identified 6 female officers whose assignment patterns and duty schedules placed them within what his analysis suggested was the operational targeting profile. He noted their routes, their hours, the specific transitions between buildings that brought them through areas of reduced visibility at predictable times. Then quietly, without filing a maintenance request or notifying base security, he made adjustments. Small encrypted devices embedded in the standard communication equipment assigned to each of the 6 officers. Emergency triggers. Silent signals routed directly to his phone if activated. The kind of modification that took less than half a minute to install and left nothing in the official inventory. The kind that should not have been necessary between soldiers who had sworn to protect each other. Sloan Drummond was on his list. He had read her file before landing. Top of her officer candidate school class by performance metrics. Perfect evaluation scores across 18 months of service. MIT graduate with a network security specialization that was genuinely uncommon at her rank. And 3 weeks into her assignment at Fort Ironwood, she had submitted a transfer request to a desk position in Maryland. The request had been withdrawn 2 days after submission. He did not know the reason, but the pattern interested him. She had come close to running and had chosen to stay. That decision, made at whatever cost, told him something about the kind of person he was dealing with. He had not spoken to her directly. He had seen her once during a building walkthrough, noted the focused quality of her attention, the particular composure of someone who was paying careful attention to something they were not broadcasting. He filed the observation. He was still watching when she made her move. On the 17th day, Sloan found the camera. She had been conducting her own physical reconnaissance during off-peak hours, moving through the base and mapping the locations where the unauthorized traffic was most concentrated. The maintenance corridor in Building 7 had appeared in the access logs as a preferred routing point, and she had decided to walk it herself. The camera was in the upper corner, where the corridor bent left, partially obscured by a junction box. The base security records listed it as non-functional offline since a maintenance issue nearly 2 years prior, pending a repair that had never been scheduled. The lens was clean, not the dusty stillness of abandoned equipment, the specific cleanliness of something recently handled, recently returned to operational readiness by someone who cared about the quality of what it was going to capture. She stood in the corridor and looked at the camera without moving. Then she checked the network traffic allocation on her phone. Live feed, recording continuously. She went back to the communications center and ran the authentication trace. 20 minutes to follow the feedback through its routing path. What she found at the end of that path stopped the breath in her chest for a moment. The camera had been reactivated using a federal override authorization code. Not base command level, not regional command level. Deputy Inspector General clearance. Someone above Fort Ironwood's entire chain of command had entered this installation and activated a camera in a maintenance corridor and was watching something. She realized slowly the same thing she had been watching for 17 days. She sat with that for a long time. Then she composed a message. Encrypted, routed through 3 separate secure relay points before it reached the federal reporting channel she had access to through her security clearance but had never previously used. She laid out everything: the unauthorized traffic, the 3 names, the correlation with transfer requests, the 5-year timeline from the archive logs. 19 days of documentation organized with the precision of someone who had been building this case as though it would one day need to hold up in a federal court, because some part of her had understood from the beginning that it would. She sent it at 11:43 at night. The response came back at 3:57 in the morning. 3 words. Continue. Document everything. No name, no rank, no explanation beyond the 3 words and the weight of federal authorization behind them. Someone above Fort Ironwood, someone with Deputy Inspector General clearance, had read her report and told her to keep going. She called Earl Maddox at 4 in the morning. "Someone else is watching," she said. He was quiet. "Federal-level Deputy IG clearance." A longer pause. When he spoke, his voice carried something that was not quite concern but contained it at its edges. "That changes the weight of what you're building." "I know. It means the investigation has institutional backing you didn't have yesterday, but it also means you are no longer doing this quietly, whatever you thought this was." He paused. "It is now larger." She looked at her screen, at the folder that had been growing for 17 days, at the network diagram she had been assembling piece by careful piece. "I was already past quiet," she said. He made a sound that was almost something warmer. "No," he said, "you are just arriving there." On the 19th day, Sloan made her decision. She had been working toward it for 4 days without naming it as such, running the variables the way her professors had taught her to run complex system problems, breaking them into components, assessing the failure points, mapping the range of outcomes. The confrontation she was planning was not designed as a confrontation. It was designed as a controlled environment where the behavior she had documented for 19 days would have the opportunity to demonstrate itself clearly on camera, with federal-level authorization recording every second. She approached Brett Harlow at 1800 hours in the commissary. He was eating with Pruitt and Vickers, which was consistent with every pattern she had observed. The 3 of them maintained a social proximity that had been unvarying throughout her observation period, the kind of clustering that comes from shared investment in shared secrets. She addressed him by rank and name in the even professional tone she used for operational communications. She told him she needed to discuss irregularities in the communications logs. She watched his expression move from surprise into calculation in less than a second. He was not unintelligent. The operation he had been running for years was not the work of careless people. He suggested somewhere private. She agreed and named the location herself, which was the detail that mattered. Building 7, Maintenance Corridor B, 23:30 hours. He nodded. She walked away without looking back. The next 5 hours were preparation. She reactivated 2 additional cameras in the maintenance corridor, confirmed their feeds, checked the recording quality from multiple angles. She ran a diagnostic on the emergency trigger device embedded in her communication equipment. She reviewed the corridor layout, the single entry point, the acoustic properties of the space, the sight lines from each camera position. At 2100 hours, she called Earl Maddox. She told him enough. There was a silence when she finished, the quality of a man choosing his words with care. "You are walking into a room with people who have done this before," he said. "I know." "On purpose?" "Yes." A longer silence. "You have prepared it well as I can." She heard him breathe. She waited for the argument against it, the older and wiser reasoning she might not have considered. But Earl Maddox had not become who he was by protecting people from necessary things. "You already know what to do," he said. "You always have." She held that for a moment. "Come out intact," he said, and the call ended. At 23:15, she walked into Maintenance Corridor B. The lighting was low, older fluorescent fixtures running at reduced power, steady and indifferent. The corridor smelled of concrete and cleaning solvent, the institutional scent of a space that had been cleaned many times and never quite felt clean. The single entrance was behind her. 3 cameras were recording in high definition. Somewhere beyond the base perimeter, a phone was receiving a live feed. She walked to the middle of the corridor and waited. They arrived at 23:25. Harlow first, then Pruitt flanking left, then Vickers coming through the entrance last and positioning himself between Sloan and the way out. The formation took approximately 4 seconds to establish, and it was not accidental. The angles, the spacing, the placement relative to the entrance, all of it had the quality of something practiced until it became automatic. This was not 3 men improvising in a corridor. This was a choreography refined through repetition. She noted that. Harlow looked at her with the expression of someone who believed they were managing a situation they did not actually control. "Lieutenant," he said, "you wanted to talk about communication logs." "Unauthorized server access," she said. Her voice was level. 19 days of encrypted traffic routed through military infrastructure to a private off-grid server. 16 regulatory violations at minimum. The temperature of the corridor changed. Pruitt completed his movement to fully block the entrance. Vickers pulled his phone and began recording. She watched both actions without responding to them. They had a phone recording. She noted it and filed it and continued watching. "You think you're smart," Harlow said. "Coming in here with your MIT degree, calling us out in front of the major, digging through logs you have no business touching. Network security is my business, Staff Sergeant. Every log on this base is my business." "Wrong answer." He grabbed her wrist. The grip was hard and deliberate, applied with the specific force of someone demonstrating a point. The impact traveled up her arm. She did not pull away, did not fight, did not make a sound. She turned her head with the careful slowness of intention toward the camera she had reactivated 4 days ago in the upper left corner of the corridor junction, and she pressed the emergency trigger on her communication device with her free hand. "You need to learn some respect," Harlow said. His voice was close and controlled, the voice of a man who had said similar things in similar rooms. "You need to learn the definition of assault under Article 120, she said. Vickers laughed. The laugh had a rehearsed quality. "Who's going to believe you 3 weeks in and you've got no history here, no credibility? The cameras in this corridor have been down for months." "Just like last time," Pruitt said. He said it without thinking. The words came out of the ease of repetition, the unguarded comment of someone operating inside a routine so established it had stopped feeling like something that needed to be monitored. "Just like last time." 3 words. Sloan heard them with the particular quality of hearing a thing you already knew spoken aloud for the first time. The data had been telling her for 19 days that there were others before her, other women, in other versions of this corridor. Other nights with the cameras conveniently dark and 3 men positioned at the entrance and the institutional machinery ready to absorb and erase whatever followed. She had built a case that pointed toward that conclusion from 17 different directions. Pruitt had just confirmed it without intending to. This was protocol, not impulse, not 3 men making a poor decision in a moment of bad judgment. A system refined through use, operating with the confidence of something that had worked before and expected to work again. 90 seconds after she pressed the trigger, footsteps came from the far end of the corridor. Not running, not hurried. The measured, deliberate pace of someone who was not rushing because they had already assessed the situation and understood how it resolved. "Step away." The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Command presence has nothing to do with volume. It is about the quality of certainty behind words, the sense that the person speaking has already accounted for every possible response and found none of them requiring significant adjustment. "Step away. Now." 3 heads turned. Declan Reeves stood at the far end of the corridor, backlit by the light from the secondary maintenance entrance behind him. He was 42 years old, and he carried himself with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 2 decades in environments where the wrong movement at the wrong moment had real consequences. He was not large in the way that draws attention. He was present in a way that made the space around him feel occupied. Harlow released Sloane's wrist. He did not step back. Private conversation, he said. Chief Warrant Officer, Reeves said, moving into the corridor with unhurried steps. Navy, outside your chain of command, which makes me the appropriate person to observe a potential Article 120 violation currently in progress. Nobody is violating anything. You grabbed her first. That is on camera, high-definition full audio running continuously for the past 72 hours. I have 11 minutes of footage from tonight beginning with the wrist contact. He paused. Would you like me to continue? The blood drained from Harlow's face. For a moment, he was very still. Then he made the decision that men who have operated in shadows long enough to mistake darkness for permanent protection always make when the darkness lifts. He lunged. Reeves sidestepped. The movement was small and precise, the economy of someone who had long since stopped wasting motion. He caught Harlow's wrist at the apex of the swing, rotated the joint with a specific and practiced pressure, redirected the momentum downward. 3 seconds. Harlow was face down on the concrete with Reeves's knee placed with exact correctness in the center of his back. Controlled, sufficient, nothing beyond what the situation required. Article 128, Reeves said calmly. Assault of a commissioned officer. Article 134, conduct unbecoming. We can add both to the list. Pruitt and Vickers did not move. 2 base security personnel appeared at the corridor entrance behind Reeves. Sergeant Roy Sullivan and Corporal Everett Madison both briefed 3 days prior, both knowing precisely what they were walking into. Sullivan's voice was even. Hands where I can see them. Vickers surrendered his phone. Pruitt followed. Reeves released Harlow into Sullivan's custody, stood, and looked at Sloan with a brief assessing attention. Medical evaluation, he said. Now. My wrist. She flexed it carefully. The throb was deep and specific, the kind that comes from a deliberate grip rather than an accident. He grabbed it hard. Sullivan, escort Lieutenant Drummond to the medical facility. Full documentation, photographs, written statement covering everything that occurred tonight. Sullivan nodded. Yes, Chief? Sloan did not move immediately. She looked at Reeves with the specific quality of attention she had been developing for 19 days, the focused examination of a thing she was not yet entirely sure she understood. How did you know to come? She asked. Because this is what I do, he said, and because you were not the first person they targeted. Something settled into place in the architecture of what she had built. Not new information exactly. The data had been pointing toward this for weeks, but hearing it stated by someone who had arrived here from Washington with a federal mandate told her something about the scale of what she had found that the data alone had not fully conveyed. How many, she said. 7 transfers in 18 months. All female, and all within 60 days of their assignment dates. All harassment complaints closed by the same investigating officer within 72 hours. Every single one marked insufficient evidence. Why did it take this long to investigate? Someone started 9 days ago, he said. He looked at her steadily. Someone else started 19 days ago without being asked, without authorization, without telling anyone who could have told her to stop. He let that stand for a moment. That was exceptional work, Lieutenant. Down the corridor, Harlow's voice rose briefly in protest, something about lawyers and chain of command, and then Sullivan spoke in a tone that did not invite continuation, and the protest stopped. Sloan looked at the corridor, at the 3 cameras she had positioned, at the place where 19 days of solitary work had produced its first visible result. She thought about the archive logs and the 5-year pattern she had mapped from them. She thought about 7 women who had filed complaints and transferred out of Fort Ironwood, carrying whatever it had cost them to do that, in the institutional machinery that had processed their departures without asking a single question. She thought about 3 words spoken without thinking. Just like last time. What happens now? She asked. Medical first. Full documentation of the injury. Your statement covers every detail of tonight, every word spoken, every action taken in the order it occurred. You do not minimize anything. You protect no one's reputation. He paused. After that, we compare what we each have. Because I have 9 days of operational assessment, and you have 19 days of technical investigation, and I suspect what we build together will be considerably larger than either of us has been seeing separately. She started toward the exit where Sullivan was waiting. Then she turned back. When you read my file, she said, you saw the transfer request. Submitted and withdrawn, he said. Yes. I withdrew it because I decided someone should stay. He held her look. Something in his expression settled in the way of a person arriving at a conclusion they had been approaching from a distance. That was the right decision, Lieutenant, he said. She walked out of the corridor into the Arizona night, her wrist carrying the specific ache of a deliberate grip, 3 cameras still recording behind her, and the knowledge that had been forming for 19 days now fully crystallized into something clear and cold and certain. This was not 3 men making bad choices in a dark corridor. This was a system. It had been running for 5 years. It had been protected from above. And she and Declan Reeves, standing in a maintenance quarter at 23:30 hours on a Thursday night in September, had just found the edge of it. The edge was not the end. She understood that completely. The work ahead was longer and harder and more consequential than anything she had done in 19 days of careful solitary building. It would require more than technical expertise and personal resolve. It would require navigating the full weight of an institution that had demonstrated across 7 separate cases and 5 years of documented operation that it was capable of using its own processes to erase the people who tried to use those processes correctly. She knew that too. She walked toward the medical facility through the quiet of Fort Ironwood, thinking about Earl Maddox picking up the phone at 5 in the morning without surprise or irritation. Thinking about a folder on an encrypted drive labeled with nothing but a date and a random string of characters. Thinking about the specific sound of 3 words spoken by a man who had no idea how much they confirmed. Just like last time, she thought about 62 women whose names she did not yet know but would. She thought about what it meant to build something that could not be quietly dismantled. Then she went inside and she gave her statement and she documented everything and she did not minimize anything at all. The medical report took 40 minutes to complete. Sloan sat in the examination room while a tired corpsman photographed her wrist, documented the bruising in clinical language that translated the reality of what had happened into the neutral vocabulary of injury assessment, and asked her 3 times if she was certain she didn't want additional evaluation. She was certain. The bruise was already darkening into a deep, specific purple, the kind that comes from a grip applied with deliberate force, and the corpsman photographed it from 4 angles and asked her to write a statement describing how it occurred, and Sloan wrote the statement with the same precision she applied to everything, every detail, every timestamp, the exact words Harlow had said, and the exact sequence in which he had said them. She did not minimize anything. When she walked back out into the pre-dawn of Fort Ironwood, the sky was beginning to shift from black to a deep, indeterminate gray, and Declan Reeves was leaning against the building wall with 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one without comment. They stood in the quiet for a moment. 3 weeks, he said, without being asked, without authorization, without telling anyone. I had Earl Maddox. Who is? Someone who used to do something like what you do, a long time ago. Reeves considered that. He gave you good advice. He gave me the only advice that mattered. Document everything. Trust the data. She looked at the coffee. I need to go back through everything I have. Cross-reference it with what you've built. At 0600, he said. Not before, you need 2 hours. She started to object. Lieutenant, his voice was not unkind, the work you do in the next 48 hours is going to matter more than anything you've done in the last 3 weeks. You need 2 hours. She slept for 90 minutes. It was not restful sleep, the kind that goes deep and returns you to yourself, but it was enough. She lay on the cot in her quarters with her eyes closed and her mind still moving through the data, the way it always moved, arranging and rearranging, and when the alarm came, she was already half awake and reaching for her phone. At 6 in the morning, Colonel Alan Foster assembled his senior staff. The conference room had the particular tension of a space where people know something significant is about to happen, but do not yet know what shape it will take. Bishop was present, seated at Foster's right hand, which was his customary position. The executive officer, the second in command, the man who had spent 3 years conducting investigations that were designed from the beginning to find nothing. Reeves did not sit. He stood at the end of the table with 2 folders in front of him and let the silence do its work for a moment before he began. He laid it out with the methodical precision of someone who had prepared this briefing carefully and intended to deliver it without interruption. 7 transfer requests in 18 months, 7 female officers, 7 harassment complaints, 7 investigations conducted by the same field officer, closed within 72 hours, identical outcome language across every single one. Bishop's face across the table remained composed. He had spent 3 years developing that composure, and it was good work. But composure is a performance, and Reeves had spent 2 decades learning to read the difference between a man who was calm and a man who was performing calm. My investigations followed proper protocol, Bishop said when Reeves paused. I made command decisions based on the available information in each case. September 2023, Reeves said. Lieutenant Brianna Hartwell. Harassment complaint filed with 4 named witnesses. Your investigation log shows 0 witness contact. 0. Your outcome report states witnesses were not credible. How did you determine credibility without contact? I assessed the overall context of the complaint. You closed it in 61 hours. I determined the evidence was insufficient. She gave you 4 names. Reeves opened the first folder. Any one of those 4 people, if you had spoken to them, would have told you something that contradicted your conclusion. You did not speak to them. You did not contact them. You marked their credibility as insufficient and closed the file. Bishop said nothing. December 2023, Reeves continued. Captain Gemma Caldwell, harassment complaint with photographic evidence documenting 14 separate incidents of being followed over a 6-week period. Your investigation closed in 48 hours with no technical analysis of the photographic evidence whatsoever. The photos were not conclusive. They showed 3 specific individuals following one woman across 14 documented occasions. That is the definition of stalking under federal statute. You closed it in 48 hours. The room was very still. Foster had not spoken since Reeves began. He sat at the head of the table with the expression of a man watching something large and inevitable approach, and not yet certain how to step out of its path. Dana Prescott stood up. She was 32 years old with 7 years of service, and she had sat in rooms like this one before, sat in them, and been quiet, and the discipline of that silence had cost her something she was not going to quantify out loud. She stood and she pulled out her phone, and she read from a 3-year-old email in a voice that was steady and clear and left no room for reinterpretation. The words were Bishop's. Written in November 2021, addressed to her when she had been a first lieutenant, with photographic evidence of a violation that was personal and serious and documented and real. Without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, pursuing this matter further may create unnecessary conflict. I encourage you to consider whether this environment aligns with your long-term career goals. She looked up from the phone. That is a threat, she said. It is phrased politely. It is phrased in the language of career advice, but it is a threat. He told me to leave or be silent, and I watched 7 more women receive the same message in one form or another over the 3 years that followed. The room absorbed this. Foster turned to Bishop. Did you write that email, Major? Bishop's composure held for another moment. Then something in it gave way, not dramatically, not with the kind of visible collapse that makes for satisfying theater, but in the quiet way of a structure that has been under too much load for too long. His jaw tightened, his hands flat on the table in front of him, pressed down slightly. I made a command decision, he said. Badge and credentials, Foster said. Now the bishop looked at the colonel for a long moment. Then he looked at Reeves. Then he looked at Sloan, who was seated at the far end of the table, and his expression did something that was not quite contempt and not quite fear. Something that lived in the territory between those two things. He slid his badge across the table. 2 base security personnel appeared at the conference room door, which meant Reeves had anticipated this moment and positioned them there beforehand, which was the kind of preparation that came from 2 decades of managing difficult outcomes. After the door closed behind Bishop, the room held its new silence. Foster looked at Reeves. How much worse does this get? We'll know more when Lieutenant Drummond and I have compared our full files, Reeves has said, but based on what she's found in the communications logs, Colonel, I want to be honest with you. Bishop is not the ceiling. Foster looked at the closed door. No, he said quietly. I didn't think he was. Sloan spent the next 2 hours in the secured conference room with Reeves, and what they built together between the 2 sets of files was something that felt, when she looked at it, laid out in full, less like an investigation and more like a map of a country that had been operating invisibly alongside the one everyone could see. Her 3 weeks of communications data, his 9 days of behavioral analysis and physical reconnaissance, the 7 transfer records, the buried complaints. The pattern of the unauthorized server traffic that she had been tracking since the first night now cross-referenced against Reeves's operational timeline. The server was not a Fort Ironwood problem. She had known this for some time, had built the evidence carefully through the archive logs, but seeing it confirmed in the combined picture of their 2 investigations made the scale of it concrete in a way that was different from knowing it abstractly. 7 installations across the Southwest region, coordinated traffic patterns running back 5 years. Administrative access points embedded in military servers at a level that should not have been possible without authorization from well above base command. 3 administrative accounts running the network. Admin_01 operational level Fort Ironwood. The face of the network on this base, the day-to-day management of the harassment operation. The digital fingerprint matched Brett Harlow's activity profile across hundreds of access events. Admin_02 unknown. But the access patterns showed a command headquarters subnet and the timing of certain critical actions, the moments when complaints had been quietly intercepted and redirected before reaching channels that might have acted on them, corresponded with the duty schedule of someone inside Fort Ironwood's command structure. Admin_07 also unknown. Regional level. The access patterns pointed to Phoenix, Southwest Regional Command Headquarters. Someone with authority that reached across multiple installations with the kind of access that allowed them to see the whole network from above had been running this for 5 years. Reeves looked at the diagram she had built. "You did this alone," he said. "I had the archive logs in 3 weeks of evenings. Federal cyber teams do this kind of work with full resources and it takes months." She looked at the diagram. "I had motivation." He was quiet for a moment. "We need to identify admin_02. "I know. I've been working on access pattern analysis. There are 3 people on Foster's staff whose duty schedules overlap with every critical admin_02 action over the past 18 months. She pulled up the data. "But I can't narrow it below 3 without additional access that I don't have authorization for." "You'll have authorization," Reeves said. "Give me the analysis." He made a call. The authorization came through 40 minutes later. Sloan ran the narrowed analysis, and then she ran it again, and then she sat back in her chair. "2 of the 3 have been off base during at least one admin_02 action," she said. "The third one hasn't." She looked at the name at the bottom of the screen. Captain Garrett Flynn, Colonel Foster's personal aide, 18 months in the position. A man who sat outside the colonel's office every day and processed the communications that crossed the commander's desk, including Sloan, was now certain every harassment complaint that had ever been submitted through official channels. He had read them before anyone else. He had known what was coming before the investigators did. And for 18 months he had been admin_02. "We move carefully," Reeves said. "We document the connection completely before we approach him." Agreed. She spent the next 3 hours building that documentation. By early afternoon, she had a file that would, she believed, hold up under any reasonable scrutiny. She was printing the final summary page when her phone vibrated. "Unknown number. Text only. Stop the investigation or more people get hurt." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she opened her network analysis tools and began to trace it. The message had been routed through 2 proxy servers before it reached her number, which suggested someone with technical competence, but not exceptional technical competence. The kind of competence that was sufficient to obscure a trail from a casual observer, but not from someone who had spent 4 years at MIT studying exactly how to follow digital breadcrumbs through civilian and military network infrastructure. It took her 11 minutes. The source materialized through the proxies like a shape becoming visible in clearing fog. Command Headquarters, Building 4, a workstation in an office registered to a captain on the colonel's personal staff. She cross-referenced the subnet with the personnel assignment records. Captain Garrett Flynn. Admin_02 had just sent her a threat from his work computer. She showed it to Reeves. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "He knows we're close," she said. "He's running out of options, and he knows it." Reeves was already reaching for his secure phone. "We need to move before he destroys anything." He moved to the door, and she was already pulling up the base access logs to check Flynn's current location, and then she stopped. She looked at the screen. Flynn's access badge had last scanned into Building 4 at 11:47 that morning. It was now 2:18 in the afternoon. He had not scanned out. But when she checked the building's internal camera logs, Building 4's lobby camera showed him walking out through a side entrance at 12:53, carrying a laptop bag and a jacket using the door that did not have a badge reader. He was already gone. Reeves's call to base security went out inside 60 seconds. The description, the vehicle, the instruction to treat it as a federal matter and not allow Flynn to leave the installation. The response came back 5 minutes later. Flynn's vehicle was not in the parking area. Gate security had no record of him passing through the main entrance. They were checking secondary exit points. 10 minutes after that, Flynn's car found abandoned at a gas station 38 miles south of Fort Ironwood. Security footage showed him transferring to a second vehicle, a dark SUV, no visible plates, heading toward the New Mexico state line. Reeves ended the call. "State police," he said. "They'll get him." He looked at her. "You identified admin_02. That matters. But Lieutenant, you need to understand something. Flynn was Foster's aide for 18 months. He had access to every complaint, every investigation, every transfer request that crossed the command desk. He knew what to bury and he knew how to bury it. He paused. Which means the question now is whether Foster knew. Knew or was deliberately kept blind. Yes, and either answer ends his career. Sloan said nothing. She was already thinking about the next layer. The next layer came for her before she could go looking for it. She was back at her workstation in the communications center running the documentation review that would support the case against Flynn when her encrypted personal device received a message from a Fort Ironwood internal address she did not immediately recognize. The message was from a legal affairs specialist on the base administrative staff. It informed her in formal and precise language that Major Ronald Bishop had filed a formal complaint against her. The complaint alleged that she had exceeded her authorized access during the security audit, had activated surveillance equipment without proper authorization, had manufactured or altered network log data to implicate personnel, and had conducted unauthorized intelligence activities while misrepresenting them as routine communications functions. The complaint had been received and reviewed. Pending investigation of these allegations, she was relieved of all operational duties and all access to base communication systems effective immediately. Her security credentials had been suspended. She read the message twice. The secondary shock was worse than the first. The first was surprise. The second was recognition. This was what it felt like. Not the physical confrontation in the corridor with 3 men blocking the exit. This, the institutional mechanics of being erased. The form language, the formal complaint, the suspension of credentials. The way the system could turn its own procedures against the people those procedures were supposed to protect. She thought about 7 women in 18 months who had filed complaints and been met with something exactly like this. Not the same words, but the same mechanism. The same quiet, formal redirection of consequence away from the people who deserved it and on to the people who had tried to report them. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Earl Maddox. He answered in 2 rings. She told him. He was quiet for longer than she expected. She could hear him breathing the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had been in enough situations where the wrong reaction was ruinous to have developed a practiced patience that went all the way down. Bishop filed it before they got him out of the building, Maddox said. He must have had it prepared. Yes, he said, he probably did. Another pause. This is how they've been doing it for 5 years. Not with threats most of the time. With process, with the machinery of the institution itself. His voice was even, but there was something beneath the evenness, something that had weight and temperature. They knew how to use the rules because they had been using them for a long time. Against women who had less experience, less documentation, less preparation than you do. She closed her eyes briefly. My credentials are suspended. I can't access the communication systems. The evidence I've built is on an encrypted drive in the secure storage room, and I am no longer authorized to open it. I know. The Deputy IG investigation can still proceed. Reeves has access. The case doesn't need me to move forward. That's true, Maddox said, but it also means every decision from this point gets made without your technical understanding of what the evidence means, which is exactly what they want. She looked at the wall of the communications center. The room she had worked in alone for 3 weeks at 2 in the morning building, something that mattered, and she was now being told she was not authorized to be here. What do I do? She asked. It was the first time she had asked that directly without already knowing the answer. Maddox was quiet for a long time. There is a version of this where you accept the suspension trust, the federal investigation to proceed without you and protect yourself, he said. That is a reasonable choice. Nobody could fault you for it. And the other version is that Reeves takes this over your head, not through Foster's chain of command, directly to the Deputy IG, bypasses Fort Ironwood entirely. The IG can override the suspension with a federal authority designation. Flynn's complaint dies. Your access is restored. But it means going around the base command structure in a way that will make enemies. It will make enemies anyway. Yes, he said, but there is a difference between making enemies as a consequence of doing the right thing and making enemies by taking an action that can later be characterized as insubordinate. The distinction matters for what comes after. She understood what he was saying. He was saying that how she did this would be part of the record. That the case she was building was not just about what happened in Building 7 at 2315 on a specific night. It was about whether the person who built it could be trusted and whether the way she built it would hold up to the kind of scrutiny that was going to come. Reeves makes the call, she said. I take every consequence. Make sure he understands that, clearly. I will. Sloan? Yes, sir. They are using the system against you because they have nothing else left. That means they're already losing. He paused. Document this too. She went to find Reeves. He was in the conference room on his secure phone, and he looked up when she came in and read her expression in approximately 1 second, the way people who have spent years reading operational situations read them with the kind of efficiency that has nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with training. She told him. She showed him the message. She told him what Maddox had said and what she had decided. He looked at her for a moment when she finished. You're certain, he said. It was not really a question. Do it, she said. I'll take every consequence. He nodded once. He picked up his secure phone and he called the Deputy Inspector General, directly bypassing Fort Ironwood's entire command structure, and he explained what had happened in the precise, unemotional language of a federal officer who had been doing this kind of work for 20 years and knew exactly what was at stake. The Deputy IG's response was immediate. Colonel Foster received a call 16 minutes later. Flynn's complaint was suspended pending federal review. Sloan's credentials were restored with a federal authority designation that placed her communications work on the case under Deputy IG jurisdiction outside the reach of base command. Flynn's personnel file was flagged for federal investigation. It took 3 hours. During those 3 hours, Sloan sat in the conference room and did not touch her suspended credentials, and did not access the communication systems, and did not do anything that could be characterized as exceeding her authority. She sat with her phone and her thoughts and the memory of what Bishop's suspension had felt like landing in her inbox, and she held on to the thing Earl Maddox had said. They are using the system against you because they have nothing else left. When her credentials were restored, she went back to work. Flynn was apprehended by New Mexico State Police at 2:17 in the afternoon on a rural highway 43 miles south of Albuquerque after a state police unit identified the dark SUV from the description that had been distributed through federal law enforcement channels. He was on foot across a stretch of high desert scrubland when the K-9 unit found him 2 miles from the abandoned vehicle carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder and moving south without any apparent plan beyond moving. The Cybercrimes Division received his electronics at 1600 hours. By 1700 hours, the lead analyst had delivered the assessment, and the assessment was not good. Military-grade AES 256 encryption with custom modifications. Biometric failsafe keyed to Flynn's fingerprints with a secondary voice authentication layer. And embedded in the encryption architecture, running quietly in the background, since the moment Flynn had entered federal custody, a 24-hour countdown clock connected to an automatic wipe protocol that would, when it reached 0, overwrite every file on every device with 16 passes of random data, rendering the contents forensically unrecoverable. The clock had started at 1400 hours. It was now 17:15. They had until 1400 hours the following day, 20 hours and 45 minutes to break military-grade encryption that the FBI's Cybercrimes Division, with their full complement of resources and tools estimated, would normally require between 2 and 4 weeks. The lead analyst, a man named Garrison with 11 years of federal cyber experience, laid this out to Reeves with the controlled calm of someone delivering genuinely bad news professionally. 20 hours, Reeves said, assuming the wipe clock runs to its scheduled endpoint. If there's a remote trigger, it could be shorter. What's the realistic ceiling for your team? Garrison looked at his screen. In 20 hours, with everything we have, I would give you maybe 40% odds on the outer encryption layer. The inner partition where the operational files are, I don't want to speculate. Reeves looked at Sloan. She had been standing at the edge of the room listening, and she had been thinking since the moment Garrison began his assessment. Not about the difficulty of the problem, about something else. About a pattern she had observed across 5 years of Flynn's server access logs, a behavioral signature she had noticed in passing 3 weeks ago and filed away without yet understanding why it mattered. Let me try, she said. Garrison looked at her. With respect, Lieutenant, this encryption was built by people who do this professionally. I know what the encryption was built by. I'm not going to attack the encryption. She moved toward the primary workstation. I'm going to attack the person who built the password. Garrison looked at Reeves. Reeves looked at the clock on the wall. Step aside to a taunt, he said. Sloan sat down. The approach was not the approach Garrison's team had been using, which was the correct approach for attacking an encryption system. She was not attacking the system. She was attacking the man who had created it, which was a different problem entirely, and one that was better suited to what she had spent 3 weeks doing. She pulled up Flynn's server access logs, 5 years of data, Not the content of what he had accessed. She didn't need the content. She needed the exhaust, the metadata, the behavioral residue that accumulated around a person's digital habits, the way physical habits leave traces in the physical world. She was looking for patterns, the way he logged in, the times he preferred, the duration of his sessions, the rhythm of his access. Every person who uses a digital system develops a behavioral fingerprint, a set of habits so consistent and so automatic that the person themselves is often not consciously aware of them. The habits become invisible through repetition. They feel like nothing. They feel like just the way you do things. They are actually a map. She worked through the timestamps first. 5 years of access events, hundreds of individual sessions. She built a frequency analysis charting every login time across the entire dataset, looking for clustering, looking for the moments in the day that Flynn returned to again and again across years of operation. 3 time clusters emerged: 7:15 in the morning, 14:07 in the afternoon, 22:30 at night. She sat with those numbers. They were too precise to be operational times. Nobody accesses a personal server at exactly 7:15 in the morning for 5 straight years because that's when the work requires it. The precision was the tell. These numbers had meaning to Flynn independent of the work. They were anchors. She ran the numbers through possible interpretations: dates, coordinates, military time designations. Coordinates: 71.5 degrees north, 140.7 degrees west. She cross-referenced those coordinates with Flynn's service record: Alaska Ranger School, Advanced Arctic Warfare Training. The training ground sat at approximately those coordinates, give or take the rounding that came from stripping the decimal. Flynn had attended that course. She found the record in his personnel file. He had graduated on March 22, 2018, a date she could see clearly in the official documentation. She looked at the third number, 2230, in military date notation, the 22nd of the third month, March 22nd. She looked at the combination: Ranger School coordinates, graduation date, the kind of experience that defines a military career, the hardest thing you ever did, the moment that told you what you were made of, the kind of memory you carry so deep that it becomes part of your internal architecture, the bedrock beneath everything else. Arrogant people hide their arrogance in the things they are most proud of. She typed the password: Ranger underscore 71.5 N underscore 140.7 W underscore March 22 underscore 2018. The encryption broke at 3:47 in the morning. The room went quiet in the particular way of a room where everyone suddenly stops breathing at the same moment. Files began appearing on the screen. Not a handful, not a folder, a cascade. Layer after layer of stored data organized with the kind of meticulous care that people apply to things they intend to use for a very long time. Garrison looked at the clock. 10 hours and 13 minutes before the wipe, he said. His voice had gone slightly flat, the way voices go when something unexpected removes the ground from underneath a previously held certainty. Lieutenant Drummond, you just cracked military-grade encryption in 10 hours and 40 minutes. An encryption system that should have taken weeks. She was already reading the files. How he said, I know how networks think, she said, and I know how arrogant people hide things. They hide them in the things they're most proud of. Flynn thought the coordinates were clever. They were. But clever and secure are different qualities. She kept reading. 5 years of operational logs, communications between Flynn and Brett Harlow, communications between Flynn and personnel at 6 other Southwest region installations. The warning system: they had built an internal alert network that notified key participants whenever a formal complaint was filed through official channels, giving them time to coordinate a response before the complaint reached anyone with actual authority to act on it. The names of 28 people across 7 installations. The administrative access structure showing how the network was organized, who answered to whom, who had authority to make operational decisions. And at the top of the hierarchy, the account that had coordinated all of it, the account from which the strategic decisions had been made for 5 years, the account that had administrative privileges across all 7 installations and had used those privileges to ensure that the network survived every complaint, every near exposure, every moment when the wrong person looked too closely at the wrong server log. Admin underscore 07. She ran the trace on admin underscore 07 with the full scope of the decrypted logs now available to her. The digital signatures were extensive. IP addresses, authentication records, session logs, 5 years of activity, documenting every significant operational decision the network had made. She cross-referenced the IP addresses against the regional command infrastructure records that Reeves's federal authority designation had given her access to. The access logs pointed to Southwest Regional Command Headquarters in Phoenix. The authentication credentials matched a specific system user account. She ran the account holder's name. The result appeared on the screen and she looked at it for a long time without moving. Then she looked at Garrison. Then she picked up her phone and called Reeves, who answered on the first ring because it was 3:47 in the morning and he had not gone to sleep. "Chief," she said, "talk to me." "I'm in. 5 years of data, 28 perpetrators, all 7 installations. I have the full administrative hierarchy. And admin_07 mom, she looked at the screen, at the name, at 25 years of service record attached to that name, at the commendations in the deployment history and the photograph in the authentication profile of a man with silver hair, and the kind of face that had been trusted for a very long time by people who had not looked closely enough at what that trust had permitted. "Chief," she said, "it's a general." The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 4 seconds. "You're certain," Reeves said. "Digital signatures IP logs 5 years of authentication records. Every major operational decision this network made over 5 years traces directly to Southwest Regional Command Headquarters. Specific subnet, specific account." She paused. "Brigadier General Victor Caldwell, Deputy Commanding General for the Southwest Region." Another silence, longer this time. "Send me everything," he said. "All of it. I'm calling the Deputy IG right now." "Chief?" "Yes." She looked at the screen. At the scope of what 5 years had built and what 19 days had dismantled, and at the knowledge that the two of them, a 42-year-old counterintelligence specialist and a 24-year-old communications officer who was supposed to be worried about radio frequencies and satellite uplinks, had just identified a 1-star general as the architect of a criminal enterprise that had systematically destroyed the careers and dignity of 62 women across 7 military installations over half a decade. "The wipe clock has 10 hours left," she said. "We need to preserve the full data set through federal channels before it reaches 0. "Already moving," he said. "Good work, Lieutenant." She looked at Garrison, who was already coordinating with his team to execute the Federal Evidence Preservation Protocol, who was already doing the work of securing 5 years of irrefutable documentation before the countdown clock reached its end. She thought about a folder on an encrypted drive she had created at 2:47 in the morning, 19 days ago, labeled with nothing but a date and a string of random characters. She thought about the archive logs going back 5 years and the pattern that had emerged from them like a face in fog. She thought about Earl Maddox picking up the phone at 5 in the morning without surprise or irritation, just present and saying, "Trust the data." She thought about Brett Harlow's hand on her wrist in a poorly lit corridor and 3 words spoken without thinking that had confirmed everything she had already built. Just like last time. She looked at the screen where the name of a general sat in plain text inside a federal evidence record, and she understood something she had understood abstractly for 3 weeks, but now understood in the full weight of its reality. The network had operated for 5 years because it had been protected from above. Because the person at the top had enough authority to ensure that no complaint, no investigation, no piece of evidence ever reached a channel that could act on it. Because the system had been arranged deliberately and carefully to protect itself. And because of that arrangement, 62 women had paid a price they should never have been asked to pay. Outside the window of the cybercrimes lab, the Arizona desert was beginning its slow shift from night to the pale, tentative light that comes before the actual dawn. The day was going to arrive on schedule the way days did, regardless of what had happened in the night, and with it would come everything that followed from this moment. U.S. Marshals in Phoenix, a federal judge reviewing warrant applications, a man with 25 years of service and silver hair, and a house in the suburbs with mature oaks out front, who would answer his door in civilian clothes and find something waiting for him that his rank could not redirect. Sloan sat in the cybercrimes lab as the first gray light touched the desert outside and thought about what it cost to be right about something that powerful people had spent 5 years trying to make sure no one could prove. Then she thought about 23 hours and the work that still needed to be done before any of it was over. She turned back to the screen. She kept working. The sun was going down over Phoenix when they put the handcuffs on a general. Sloan was not there when it happened. She was 300 miles away in the cybercrimes lab at Fort Ironwood, watching the evidence preservation protocol run its final verification sweep, making certain that every file, every log, Every authentication record extracted from Flynn's encrypted drives had been properly transferred into federal custody with a chain of evidence documentation that no defense attorney in the country could meaningfully challenge. She was doing the work. She was always doing the work. But Declan Reeves had made certain that a news crew received an anonymous tip 40 minutes before the marshals arrived at Caldwell's house, and so she watched it on a small screen in the corner of the lab while Garrison's team ran their final checks, the footage arriving in real time from a Phoenix local news affiliate that had been the first to push it out and the last to understand what they were actually looking at. The dark SUVs pulling onto a quiet suburban street, the kind of neighborhood where nothing like this was supposed to happen. Caldwell answering his own door in civilian clothes, and the marshal stepping forward and the words being spoken clearly and without ceremony, and the hands going behind his back. His wife in the doorway with a dish towel, the click of metal on a general's wrists. She watched it for a moment. Then she turned back to the screen in front of her and kept working because the arrest was not the end. It was in the careful language she had been using to herself for 3 weeks a data point. A significant one, the kind that shifted the entire trajectory of the investigation, but still just a point in a sequence that had a great deal further to go. The story went national in under 10 minutes. CNN was first with the banner, then MSNBC, then the wire services, and after the wire services, the networks, and after the networks, the kind of distributed digital amplification that turns a story from significant into something else entirely. By the time Sloan finished the evidence preservation verification and closed her laptop, Brigadier General Victor Caldwell's name and face had appeared on approximately 40 million screens across the country. The Deputy Inspector General had wanted it seen. He had made the deliberate choice to allow the leak because he understood something that 25 years of bureaucratic experience had taught him, that accountability, which happens invisibly, tends to stay invisible. That the quiet resolution of serious institutional failures tends to produce the quiet resumption of those same failures in slightly altered form, and that the only reliable disinfectant remained, as it had always remained, the particular quality of light that comes from everyone watching at the same time. 62 women deserved that light. Reeves found Sloan in the lab at 6 the following morning, which meant he had not slept either, and he handed her coffee without comment, which had become a kind of language between them over the past 3 weeks. He sat across from her, and they looked at each other across the table where they had built the case together, and there was a quality to the silence that was different from every other silence they had shared. Something had been completed, not finished, not by a significant margin, but completed in the sense that a structure is completed when the last load-bearing element is in place and it becomes possible to see, for the first time, the whole of what has been built. 28 perpetrators, Reeves said, 7 installations, 1 general, 5 years. 62 victims, she said. He nodded. That was the number that mattered. The other numbers were institutional. That one was human. And Colonel Foster assembled the officer corps at 8 in the morning in the main conference room. 22 officers. He stood at the head of the table, and he did not sit down, which was itself a statement, and he spoke without preamble. He said that he had spent the night reviewing everything: the transfer records, the buried complaints, the investigation logs, the email Bishop had sent to Dana Prescott in 2021 and to 6 others in the years that followed, the same message dressed in slightly different language each time, but carrying the same essential instruction: leave or be silent and understand that the institution will not be on your side. He said that he had approved 7 transfer requests in 18 months without asking a single question about why any of those women were leaving. He said that this was not a failure of information. He had the information. It had been available to him. He had chosen consciously or not the interpretation that required the least disruption. He said, "That is on me, Mars." The room was very still. Sloan presented for 40 minutes. She had spent the previous 2 hours organizing the evidence into a briefing that any reasonably intelligent adult could follow, stripping the technical complexity down to its essential human shape. The timeline, the pattern, the administrative architecture that had allowed 28 people to operate across 7 installations for 5 years, while the official investigation structure produced with remarkable consistency the same 2-word conclusion. When she finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then Foster said that Lieutenant Drummond had built in 3 weeks and without authorization a case that the institution had failed to build in 5 years, with all its resources and all its authority and all its stated commitment to the welfare of its personnel. He said he was not going to contextualize that or explain it away. He was going to sit with the full weight of what it meant. He looked around the table. Questions, he said, can be addressed to Chief Warrant Officer Reeves. Cooperation with the federal investigation is not optional. It is a direct order. At 1400 hours, Colonel Foster assembled the entire base. 800 personnel on the main parade ground, every soldier and staff member who could be pulled from non-critical duty, standing in formation in the September afternoon heat, while the Arizona sun pushed down on everyone equally. The word had traveled through the base all day, the way significant things always travel through military installations faster than official communication and usually more accurate, and by the time the formation was called, the broad shape of what had happened was known to most of them. But knowing the shape was different from hearing it said. Foster spoke for 12 minutes. He spoke without notes. He acknowledged the 7 transfers. He acknowledged the buried complaints. He acknowledged that his command had been used for the entirety of his tenure and for years before it as an operating environment for something that he was not going to describe with the softened language of institutional failure because it was not a failure of process. It was a choice made repeatedly and deliberately by people who had decided that the comfort of the system mattered more than the safety of the people inside it. Then Sloan walked to the front, 800 people looking at a 24-year-old lieutenant who had 3 weeks ago been alone in a communications center at 2:47 in the morning, noticing something that she was not required to notice and could very easily have looked away from. She did not deliver a speech. She presented evidence. She talked for 20 minutes about what the data showed, and then she stepped back, and 15 women who were currently assigned to Fort Ironwood walked forward from the formation and stood together at the base of the platform. Dana Prescott spoke first. 3 years of silence in 2 sentences delivered without performance, just the plain weight of what had happened and what it had cost. Lieutenant Quinn Garrett, who had requested transfer to Germany 11 months ago because staying had begun to feel like a physical danger, said that she had withdrawn the transfer request after seeing Sloan do something she had not believed was possible, which was to stay and fight and build something the institution could not quietly dismantle. A 20-year-old private named Sasha Brennan, who had been at Fort Ironwood for 4 months and had not yet been targeted, but had already learned to calculate the risk of every unmonitored corridor she walked through, said that she had joined the Army because she believed it stood for something, and that watching what Sloan had done had given her a reason to keep believing that. 12 others spoke, each one brief, each one precise, each one leaving something in the air above that formation that did not dissipate. Sergeant Ray Dunbar broke ranks at the point when the 12th woman finished. He was 52 years old, 12 years of service, the kind of combat record that commands immediate respect in a military formation, and he moved through the crowd with the unhurried certainty of a man who had made a decision and intended to carry it through. He was looking at Sloan when he spoke, and his voice was loud enough to carry clearly across the formation. "This is destroying careers over hurt feelings," he said. "The military isn't a safe space. If you can't handle pressure, maybe this isn't the right place for you." The formation divided in the way formations divide when something true and ugly is said openly, half the sound moving towards agreement and half toward rejection, the cultural split made audible and visible simultaneously. Sloan let it run for exactly 5 seconds. Then she spoke, and her voice did not rise, but it carried the particular quality of a person who has spent 3 weeks handling information so serious that volume became irrelevant. "Sergeant Dunbar," she said, "Specialist Vickers' phone contained 47 videos. 17 of them involved women who were intoxicated or unconscious at the time of recording. That is not hurt feelings. That is a federal sex crime documented with forensic evidence that will be presented at trial and that will result in conviction." Staff Sergeant Harlow operated a private server containing material from 62 individuals across 5 installations. Several of the victims were under 20 when they were first targeted. The metadata, the digital signatures, the IP addresses, and the timestamps are all preserved in federal evidence. This is not an accusation. This is documentation. It will hold up in any court in the United States. She let that stand for a moment. "If you would like to defend that," she said, "please continue, but understand what you would be defending." Dunbar's mouth opened. His jaw moved. He looked at the screens where the evidence summary was still displayed, at the numbers and the names and the timeline that laid it all out with a clarity that had nothing to do with interpretation. He looked at Sloan. "I need to see the full evidence," he said. His voice was different. The certainty had gone out of it, replaced by something that was the beginning of a different kind of certainty entirely. "You'll see it at trial," Reeves said from the platform, "along with everyone else, because this investigation ends with federal prosecutions and not internal discipline." Foster dismissed the formation at 1645. 800 people dispersed into the late afternoon, carrying something they had not arrived with. 2 days after the formation, Dana Prescott submitted additional documentation. She had kept everything. 3 years of a woman who had been told by the institution to move on and had decided instead to preserve every piece of evidence she had organized in a folder on a personal encrypted drive with the same instinct for documentation that Sloan had developed independently and that Maddox had taught her before she even knew she would need it. The screenshots she had taken of the private group chat in 2021 were still intact with full metadata, timestamps, device identifiers, the EXIF data embedded in each image. Sloan ran the EXIF data through the forensic analysis tool she had been using throughout the investigation, cross-referencing the device identifiers against the equipment logs she had access to through her communications director function. The device that had created and distributed that content in 2021 had a unique identifier embedded in its metadata. She ran the identifier against the base equipment registry and the personnel records and the access logs. She found the match in 40 seconds. She sat with it for a moment. Then she ran a secondary verification because this mattered too much to present without being certain, and the secondary verification confirmed the primary result. The device identifier matched Brett Harlow's issued equipment. That was not the discovery. She had already connected Harlow to the server and the content through 5 years of operational logs. That connection was solid. The discovery was something else. When she ran the group chat membership metadata against the base personnel records, the list of account holders who had been members of the chat in November 2021, she found a name that had not appeared in any previous analysis of the operational network. Major Ronald Bishop, not in the investigative files, not in the harassment network logs as a coordinator or a participant, in the group chat itself as a member. An active member according to the access records who had logged in 23 times across the 4 months the chat was active. Bishop had not simply buried complaints. He had been a participant in the conduct those complaints were about. He had received and reviewed the content. He had been a member of the private group where it was distributed. He had sat in an investigator's chair and listened to Dana Prescott describe what had been done to her and had closed the case in 3 days and then gone back to the group chat that he was still an active member of. She brought it to Reeves at 9 in the morning. He looked at the evidence for a long time without speaking. "This changes the charge profile," he said, "from negligence in the conduct of investigations to active participation in the underlying conduct. Yes, it means he wasn't a bad investigator. He was an informed participant running investigations designed to protect a network he was part of. That's what the evidence shows." Reeves picked up his secure phone. The call to the federal prosecutors handling Bishop's case lasted 22 minutes, and when it ended, Bishop's charge sheet had expanded significantly, and the federal prosecutors were, according to the brief summary Reeves relayed to her afterward, gratified in the particular way of people whose already strong case has just become stronger. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in November, 8 weeks after the arrests in the federal courthouse in Albuquerque. The courtroom had the particular atmosphere of a space that had absorbed a great deal of human consequence over many years, the specific weight of a room where things were decided that could not be undecided. The gallery was full. Sloan did not look at the gallery when she walked in. She had learned in the weeks of preparation with the federal prosecutors that looking at the gallery was a way of seeing your own nervousness reflected back at you in other people's expressions, and she could not afford that. She was looking for one face, and she found it in the third row from the back. Earl Maddox, 67 years old in a dark jacket, sitting with the stillness of a man who had learned patience through the kind of experiences that either teach patience or break you, and looking at her with an expression that contained everything he might have said if this had been a phone call at 5 in the morning instead of a federal courtroom in November. She did not nod. He did not nod. They just looked at each other for a moment, and that was enough. She took her seat in the witness box. The prosecution attorney was a woman named Sarah Vance, 15 years of federal experience, who had spent 3 days preparing Sloan for testimony and who had been in that preparation both thorough and direct. She had told Sloan exactly what the defense would do. She had told her not to get angry, not to get defensive, and not to explain more than the question required. She had told her to trust what she had built. Vance began with credentials: the MIT degree, the Army Signal School certifications, 18 months of communications security, 43 security incidents, investigated 12 of them, 12 unauthorized access attempts, identified 0 successful breaches of systems under her responsibility. She built the foundation brick by careful brick, establishing for the jury not just that Sloan was qualified, but that she was qualified in ways that were measurable and specific and documented. Then she walked her through the case, the 2:47 in the morning discovery, the 19 days of evidence building, the network diagram displayed now on a screen large enough for every juror to read clearly, showing the structure of what had operated for 5 years across 7 installations. The timeline, the correlation with transfer requests, the administrative accounts, and the hierarchy they represented. She walked them through admin_01 and Brett Harlow and 3 weeks of unauthorized server access. She walked them through Flynn and the encrypted drives and the 20-hour countdown clock and the behavioral analysis that had broken it. She walked them through admin_07 and the Phoenix 1P addresses and the authentication records and the name at the end of the chain. The jury was paying attention. She could see it. Not polite attention, the kind people perform to avoid appearing rude, but the genuine kind, the kind that comes from following something complex and finding that it holds together. Gerald Moss stood for cross-examination. He was Harlow's civilian defense attorney, a man in his early 60s with a careful, unhurried manner and a reputation for turning technical complexity into reasonable doubt, and he had been building his approach for 8 weeks. He began with her age, 24. He let that number sit in the air for a moment before moving to the next point, which was that she held no federal law enforcement certification, that she was not a credentialed forensic examiner, that her training was in communications infrastructure, not criminal investigation. She answered each point with the same even precision. Her training was in network security. Network security required the ability to investigate unauthorized access as a core function. Her record in that function was documented and verifiable. He shifted to the confrontation in Building 7. He suggested that she had engineered it, had planned it, had deliberately placed herself in a situation designed to provoke a response that could be recorded and used against his client. She said that she had confronted Harlow about documented unauthorized server access, which was within her authority as communications officer. His response had been his choice, not hers. He said the word entrapment. She said the word investigation. He tried 3 more angles, each one a different approach to the same essential argument, which was that a 24-year-old communications officer had exceeded her role and contaminated a case that would otherwise not exist. She answered each approach with the same thing, which was the evidence described plainly and precisely, leaving no room for the alternative interpretation to take hold. Moss paused, shuffled his papers. Then he turned and picked up a document from the defense table, and he brought it to the bench and submitted it as a defense exhibit, and when the exhibit number was assigned, he turned to face Sloan with an expression that was professionally neutral, but contained behind the neutrality something that was anticipating its own effect. He told her what the document was. It was a communications log, her communications log from the early days of her investigation, with her digital signature, with timestamps that matched the period in question, and with content that showed, according to Moss, that certain packet capture data had been modified after initial collection, that specific timestamps had been altered, and that the chain of custody for 3 key pieces of evidence in the case against his client had been compromised at the source. He looked at her. "Captain Drummond," he said, "is this your digital signature on this document?" The courtroom was very still. Sloan looked at the document on the screen in front of her. She read it. She read it again with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that did not match what she knew to be true. The focused, patient examination of an anomaly before drawing a conclusion about its nature. Her signature was on the document. The timestamps were consistent with the period in question. The content was not what she had created. It looked exactly like evidence of what Moss was claiming. To someone who did not know how to check it, it would have been effectively indistinguishable from the real thing. It had been constructed with care by someone who understood the basic structure of communications log documentation. Someone who had access to the format. Someone who had known in advance that this specific document would be submitted as defense evidence and had prepared it accordingly. Someone who had done it during the weeks of pretrial proceedings when the evidence package had been in the custody of the court system and had passed through enough hands that a sufficiently motivated person with connections to the right places could have inserted a falsified document into the chain. She looked at Moss. "I would like 10 minutes, she said. He looked at the judge. The judge looked at Sloan with the expression of a person assessing the nature of a request. "The technical nature of the claim requires technical verification," Sloan said. "I can demonstrate the status of this document in 10 minutes. If I'm wrong, the court loses 10 minutes. If I'm right, it matters considerably." The judge allowed it. Reeves was in the gallery. He had a secure laptop. It took him 45 seconds to bring it forward and set it up at the witness stand. And during those 45 seconds, the courtroom held the specific silence of a room where something is about to happen that no one can predict. The document that Moss had submitted to the court had a digital signature. All official communications documents did. The signature was a hash, a cryptographic fingerprint generated at the moment of creation, unique to that document. At that moment, impossible to replicate exactly if any element of the document was altered after creation. But there was a second layer. When Sloan had designed the evidence preservation system during the investigation, she had built into it a blockchain-based verification architecture, a distributed ledger that recorded the hash of every piece of evidence at the moment it entered the chain of custody, distributed across multiple independent nodes so that no single point of access could alter it without the alteration being immediately visible to every other node. The system did not trust any single record. It cross-verified constantly automatically without requiring human oversight. She pulled up the blockchain verification interface on the secure laptop. She entered the document identifier from the exhibit Moss had submitted. The verification ran in 11 seconds. The result appeared on the screen. The document Moss had submitted had a hash that did not match the blockchain record. The blockchain record showed the original document created on the correct date with the correct content with a hash that had remained unchanged across every verification since the moment it entered federal custody. The document Moss had submitted had been modified. The blockchain record showed exactly when the modification had occurred, 11 days after the initial arrest of Brett Harlow, during the pretrial proceedings when the evidence package had been in court system custody. The blockchain record also showed the access point from which the modification had been attempted. The IP address corresponded to a court system terminal that had been used during the pretrial discovery process by a member of the defense legal team with a previously undisclosed connection to the network that the investigation had dismantled. Someone in the defense apparatus, reaching back into the network they had served, had created a falsified document and introduced it into the evidence chain. And the system Sloan had built had caught it, not because anyone was watching, not because anyone had been alerted, because the system remembered everything. And everything it remembered was verifiable, and verification was automatic, and nothing that had been entered into it could be silently changed without every other part of the system immediately seeing the discrepancy and recording it. She turned the screen so the jury could see it. She explained what they were looking at. She explained what a blockchain hash was and what it meant that the hashes did not match. She explained when the modification had occurred and where it had come from. She explained it in the plain, patient language of someone who has spent a great deal of time making technical complexity accessible to people who did not grow up thinking about how networks work. A juror in the second row was nodding. Another was writing something down. Moss was very still at the defense table. The judge looked at the screen, then at Sloan, then at the document Moss had submitted. She said something quiet to the clerk. The clerk made a note. Sarah Vance stood for redirect. "Captain Drummond," she said, "the evidence preservation system that just verified the authenticity of the original document and identified the falsified exhibit. Who built that system?" "I did," Sloan said, during the investigation. "I built it because I understood from watching how the network operated that any evidence preservation system which relied on a single point of custody could be compromised by someone with access to that single point. The blockchain architecture distributes the record across multiple independent nodes. Altering any one node immediately creates a discrepancy visible to all the others. So you built a system that anticipated someone would try exactly what was attempted today. I built a system that made certain the truth would outlast any attempt to change it." Vance paused. No further questions. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 11 minutes. The foreperson read the verdict into a courtroom that had been filling with accumulated silence for 11 weeks. Guilty on all counts, every charge. Article 120 violations. Conspiracy, obstruction, federal sex crimes. Brett Harlow looked at the table in front of him while the verdicts were read, and then he looked at nothing. 27 more trials followed over the next 8 months. Every one of them ended the same way. Because the evidence was the same in every case, the same 5 years of documentation, the same blockchain verified chain of custody, the same network diagram showing 28 people and the architecture that had connected them. And it was the same because Sloan had built it to be the same, had built it with the understanding that building it right once was better than building it partially many times. Ray Dunbar came to find her 2 days after the verdict. He asked to meet somewhere neutral with the door open, and she agreed to the conference room where she and Reeves had built the case together, which had over the preceding weeks become a kind of anchor point for her, a place where the work had been real and visible, and hers. He was 52 years old, and he looked when he sat down across from her as if the past 8 weeks had added years to that number. Not the physical years of age, but the other kind, the ones that come from having to revise something you believed about yourself. He told her he had spent 4 days after the formation trying to reconcile two things: the man he had served beside in combat, who had been in the operational context of deployment, exactly what a soldier was supposed to be: reliable, competent, capable under pressure, someone you trusted with your life in the specific literal sense of that phrase. And the man the evidence described, who had used a military installation as an operating environment for 5 years of organized predation. He said he had defended Harlow at the formation because he had wanted the first version to be the whole version, because it was easier to believe that 62 women had misunderstood something than to believe that someone he had respected was two things at once, both a capable soldier and a man who had done what the evidence showed he had done. He said he understood now that the two things were not in contradiction, that a person could be good at their job and commit serious crimes, that the competence he had witnessed did not excuse or disprove the conduct he had refused to examine. He said that was wrong. The formation comment was wrong. I said it because I was protecting a belief that the evidence had already dismantled, and the women in that formation deserved better than what I gave them. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. I'm going to testify at every remaining trial, he said. I'll teach bystander intervention training for the new command. I'll talk to any soldier on this base who is where I was 8 weeks ago, who doesn't want to believe it, because I know what that place feels like from the inside, and I might be able to reach someone that the official line of argument can't. He paused. Whatever helps fix what I helped break by staying silent. She looked at him, not at the performance of accountability, because it was not a performance. It was the real thing, which was less polished and more exhausting and more credible for both of those qualities. I'll hold you to that, she said. He stood to leave, then turned back. 12 years in this military, he said. I've seen good officers and I've seen bad officers. What you did building a case in 3 weeks while still doing your regular duties, that's the best leadership I've seen from anyone at any rank. He stopped. You didn't wait for permission. You didn't wait for someone with more authority to fix it. You just fixed it. That's what this is supposed to look like. He left. Sloan sat in the conference room for a while after he was gone, holding what he had said and what it cost him to say it, and the particular kind of respect that comes from watching someone choose accountability over ego when the easier choice was still available to them. The letter arrived from the Pentagon 3 days later. It informed her in the formal language of official military correspondence that effective immediately she was promoted to the rank of captain. The promotion was designated as a field promotion for exceptional service under conditions of significant institutional adversity, and it came with a dual assignment as communications director for Fort Ironwood and as a climate reform liaison for a Department of Defense pilot program that was being developed at the regional level. She stared at the letter for a long time. Reeves found her in the conference room with the letter on the table in front of her. "Congratulations, Captain," he said. "I wanted convictions. You'll get both." He sat down. "The promotion is not ceremonial. The DoD wants you to design the reporting architecture for the pilot program, a system that prevents this from happening at the institutional level. They want the Ironwood Protocol implemented across the entire Southwest region." She looked at the letter, at the weight it represented, not of recognition, but of responsibility, the difference between being asked to do something and being made responsible for ensuring it was done. "How many installations?" she said. "7 to begin, 15,000 in personnel, with expansion pending evaluation. That's a lot of infrastructure. You built the prototype in 3 weeks during an active investigation while running regular duties," he said. "I think you can handle the expansion." The Ironwood Protocol went live across all 7 Southwest region installations on a Thursday in December, deployed in a ceremony that was attended by the Deputy Inspector General and 2 Department of Defense senior officials, and 15,000 personnel who received the notification through their command communications channels at precisely the same time. The system was not complicated to use. That had been one of Sloan's central design principles. Complexity was a barrier to reporting, and barriers to reporting were what had allowed the network to operate for 5 years. The encrypted submission interface required 4 steps in 3 minutes and guaranteed that every report was simultaneously logged in an external federal oversight database that no base command structure could access or modify. Every report triggered an automatic notification to an independent investigation team outside the chain of command of the installation where the report originated within 24 hours. No more insufficient evidence findings produced by investigators with personal stakes in the outcome. No more complaints that disappeared between the filing and the investigation. No more template language applied to 7 separate cases by the same man protecting the same network. The system remembered everything. 11 weeks after the protocol went live, a report came through from Fort Ironwood. Second Lieutenant Breanne Holloway, 23 years old, 4 months into her assignment, had used the encrypted reporting interface to document a pattern of harassment involving 2 male NCOs. Following her for 3 weeks, inappropriate comments at duty transitions, the same warning signs that had appeared in every previous case, the same early-stage behavior that in the years before the protocol existed would have been allowed to continue and escalate until the woman bearing it made the calculation that leaving was safer than staying. The report triggered the automatic protocol at 1400 hours on a Tuesday. An external oversight team was deployed by 1600 hours. An independent investigation began at 1800 hours. Both NCOs were placed in restricted duty status and separated from Holloway's operational environment within 2 hours of the report. 71 hours later, the investigation concluded. Both NCOs were found to have engaged in conduct substantiated by the evidence Holloway had documented: administrative separation with prejudice, dishonorable discharge recommendations forwarded to the appropriate command authority, federal records reflecting the findings permanent and unalterable. Sloan read the outcome report at her desk in the communications center and sat with it for a while. This was what she had built it for. Not the investigation that had preceded it, not the arrests or the trials or the general in handcuffs on a Phoenix street, all of which had been necessary and right, but which had been fundamentally a response to failure. This was the other thing, the prevention of the next failure. The system that meant the next Breanne Holloway did not have to spend 3 weeks building evidence alone at 2:47 in the morning and engineering a confrontation in a poorly lit corridor because there was no other mechanism available to her. She met with Holloway the following afternoon. The young lieutenant was 23 years old, which was 1 year younger than Sloan had been when she first walked into that communications center on a Tuesday night in September, and she had the look of someone who had been through something serious and come out the other side of it, still standing and not entirely sure yet what to make of that. She said she had almost not reported. She had done the calculation that women in military environments learn to weighed the credibility of the reporting channel against the cost of using it and being disbelieved, and the ledger had very nearly come down on the side of silence. But she had used the system, and the system had worked. Sloan told her you protected your career by reporting, by refusing to absorb something you should never have been asked to absorb. That is what's different now. Silence used to be survival. Now accountability is survival. The culture has flipped, not completely, not everywhere, but here measurably, because enough people decided that the institution they had committed their lives to was worth building into something that deserved that commitment. Holloway nodded slowly. Then she said something that Sloan carried with her for a long time afterward. She said, "I reported because of you. Not because I knew you personally or because someone told me to. Because I knew what had happened at this base, what you had done, and I thought if a 24-year-old lieutenant could do that with no authorization and no backup and no guarantee that anyone would believe her, then I could use a system that was specifically designed to work. I thought I owed you that." Declan Reeves received his reassignment orders in March. Fort McKenzie, Montana. Same mission, different base. A different set of numbers that told the same story. 7 female personnel who had transferred out in the preceding 14 months. Harassment complaints marked insufficient evidence by the same investigating officer. A pattern that Reeves recognized immediately because he had spent 6 months learning to recognize it at its source. Sloan organized the send-off the way she organized everything, with attention to what mattered and without excess. A formation at 900 hours. 80 personnel. The core group who had made the transformation possible. Colonel Foster presented a commendation. Joint Service Achievement, Federal Military Cooperation language about investigations that changed institutional culture. Afterward, in the parking area, Reeves loaded his vehicle and Sloan stood with her hands in her jacket pockets and the March air moving across the Arizona desert with the particular quality of early spring, not warm yet, but no longer carrying the edge of winter. "Fort McKenzie," she said. "Same patterns, Different names. I know. She reached into her jacket and took out a folder, which is why I've been monitoring their network traffic for the past 3 months. He looked at the folder, then at her. As part of your regional communications director responsibilities, he said, everything that passes through Southwest Region communications infrastructure passes through my oversight function. Fort McKenzie falls within the region. He opened the folder. He read the first 2 pages. He stopped. 3 unauthorized encrypted servers, he said, active for at least 18 months based on the archive log analysis. Administrative access patterns consistent with command-level protection. The digital signatures are different, but the architecture is identical. She paused. Same system, different operators. He turned to the next page. You've mapped the network already. I've mapped what's visible from the communications director level. You'll need to do the ground investigation, but you won't need 6 days of reconnaissance before you have targets. You can start on day 1. He looked at the folder for a long moment. Then he looked at her. You've been building a case against Fort McKenzie, he said, while implementing the Ironwood protocol across 7 installations and managing Fort Ironwood's communications infrastructure and testifying in 28 federal trials. I've been doing my job, she said. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something that had the same quality. Good decision, Captain, he said. The echo of her own words from a maintenance corridor at 23:30 hours on a September night was deliberate, and she knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them said anything further about it. He shook her hand, got in the vehicle, drove away. She stood in the parking area until the vehicle was gone, and then she stood there a little longer, looking at the desert and the mountains beyond it, and the pale blue March sky over Fort Ironwood. Earl Maddox had been watching from a bench near the building entrance. When she turned back toward the communications center, he fell into step beside her, which was something he had taken to doing during his visits to the base over the preceding months, walking with her between buildings without necessarily having something specific to say, the way people who have known each other through serious things sometimes prefer to be present without filling the space with words. They walked for a while. He's going to Fort McKenzie, Maddox said, with a 6-month head start on the investigation. Because of you. Because of the work. He was quiet for a moment. The March wind moved between them. There are 3 other installations, he said. It was not a question. Fort Wooka, White Sands, Camp Bravo. I've been monitoring all 3. The patterns are there, different stages, different scales, but the same underlying architecture. She looked at the mountains. The Ironwood protocol will help. It will make it harder to operate in the open. But harder is not impossible, and the people who build these things are not unintelligent. No, he said, they're not. Which means the monitoring has to be continuous. The analysis has to be ongoing. The system has to be maintained by people who understand why it was built and what it's designed to prevent. That's a long commitment, he said. Yes, she said, it is. They reached the communications center entrance and stopped. Maddox looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize over the years of knowing him. The look of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether the moment requires it to be said aloud or whether it has already been said sufficiently by everything that had come before. He decided in favor of silence. He put his hand on her shoulder for a moment, the brief, specific weight of it, and then he went to find his rental car and the drive back to Phoenix. She went inside. At 2:47 in the morning, the communications center was exactly as quiet as it always was at that hour. Sloan sat alone at her primary workstation, the screens throwing their pale light across her face, the servers breathing their quiet mechanical breath around her. She was running a security audit. That was what the log would say if anyone looked at it later, and it was technically true. But the audit tonight was not of Fort Ironwood. She was running the ongoing network monitoring sweep for all 7 Southwest Region installations that she had built into her regular duty cycle, the systematic surveillance that had become as routine to her now as the original security audit had been on that September night 18 months ago. The sweep ran automatically, comparing current network traffic patterns against the baseline profiles she had established for each installation, flagging anomalies for review. She was reviewing the flagged anomalies from the previous 72 hours when a notification appeared on the secondary screen. Not an anomaly flag from the monitoring sweep, an Ironwood protocol submission notification. An incoming report routed through the encrypted submission interface from a base in the Southeast region. Not Southwest. Southeast, a base outside her direct oversight function. A base that had received a briefing on the Ironwood protocol 3 months ago as part of a DO'd pilot expansion briefing and had implemented a version of the system and had sent a junior officer to a 2-day training seminar on the reporting architecture. The report had come through the submission interface. It had been automatically logged in the external federal oversight database. It had triggered the automatic notification to the independent investigation team assigned to that region, all without anyone at that installation needing to make a phone call, all without anyone needing to decide whether to believe the person reporting, all without the report passing through any hand in the local chain of command before it reached people with authority and no conflict of interest. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. Sloan looked at the screen for a long time. She thought about a Tuesday morning in September, 18 months ago, when she had been alone in this room at 2:47 in the morning and had noticed something that she was not required to notice and could have looked away from. She thought about Earl Maddox saying document everything and trust the data, and about the particular quality of a 5 in the morning phone call answered without surprise or irritation. Just the steady presence of someone who had been in difficult places and knew that the most important thing you could do in them was to stay awake and keep your eyes open. She thought about 62 women whose names she knew all of them. She had memorized every name in the case file months ago, and the names had stayed with her, and about Breanne Holloway, who had almost not reported and had reported anyway, and had been answered by a system that worked. She thought about what it meant to build something that kept working after you stopped watching it. That remembered on its own. That made the truth harder to erase than the lie. She looked at the Southeast Region report on the secondary screen, at the notification that someone somewhere had used the interface and the system had caught it and the system was moving. She thought about Reeves driving toward Montana with a folder full of network analysis and a 6-month head start. She thought about 3 other installations and the work that was still out there, patient and real, in waiting. Then she turned back to the primary screen and kept working because the work did not end and the hour did not matter, and the quiet of the communications center was not emptiness, but the particular fullness of a place where important things happen that most people never saw, and she had made her peace a long time ago with being one of the people who saw them. Outside the Fort Ironwood Communications Center, the Arizona desert held its nighttime silence, and the stars were very clear. And somewhere above Phoenix, a general was preparing to answer for 5 years of choices that had seemed for a long time like choices that carried no consequence. The system remembered, even when people chose to forget. That was what she had built, not just a protocol, a conscience.